The Hammer's Song. The first blush of dawn painted the eastern sky in muted lavenders and soft greys, a familiar signal for Jacob. He stirred, the worn quilt a comforting weight against his shoulders, and listened to the gentle rhythm of his wife's breathing beside him. Another day of coaxing metal to yield, of honoring the traditions passed down through generations. A quiet sense of purpose settled over him, laced with a familiar melancholy, a whisper of how few now understood the song of the hammer, a melody that once echoed across countless valleys. He rose with the practiced grace of a man who had greeted countless dawns, his bare feet silent on the cool plank floor. The small, neat room was still dim, the shapes of the simple furniture barely visible. He dressed in his usual work clothes, sturdy trousers, a plain shirt, and a leather apron that bore the marks of 1,000 battles with glowing iron. A quick glance out the window confirmed the promise of a clear, crisp morning. The air would bite, but the sun would soon warm the forge. A steaming mug of coffee, strong and dark, awaited him on the kitchen table, courtesy of his early-rising wife, Sarah. He took a sip, the heat a welcome jolt against the lingering chill of sleep. She was already out, tending to the hens, her own daily ritual as ingrained as his. Jacob appreciated these quiet moments of solitude, the time to gather his thoughts before the demanding dance of fire and steel began. He felt the weight of his family's legacy in his calloused hands, a responsibility he carried with quiet pride. With the last sip of coffee, he stepped out into the crisp morning air. The path to his workshop, a short walk across the yard, was already imprinted in his muscle memory. The air here was different, thick with the subtle, comforting scent of coal dust that clung to the weathered wood of the smithy, mingling with the fainter metallic tang of iron. The shop, a sturdy timber structure that had stood for well over a century, felt less like a building and more like a living entity, breathing the history of his ancestors. It was a sanctuary, a place where time bent to the will of the forge. Inside, the shadows still clung to the corners, but the familiar shapes of tools and anvils emerged as his eyes adjusted. The large bellows, looking like a sleeping dragon, rested beside the hearth. Tongs, hammers of various weights, and chisels hung neatly on their pegs, each with its own story etched into its well-used surface. The workbench, scarred and blackened, held a collection of raw iron stock, waiting to be transformed. Jacob moved with deliberate purpose, his movements economical and precise. He swept the previous day's ash from the hearth, a fine grey powder that swirled briefly before settling. Then he began to lay the fire. Small pieces of kindling first, arranged in a careful pyramid, followed by larger chunks of seasoned wood, and finally, the dark, lustrous lumps of bituminous coal. He struck a match, the sudden flare a tiny sun in the dimness, and touched it to the kindling. A fragile tendril of smoke curled upwards, followed by the hesitant dance of a small flame. This was the beginning, the sacred spark from which all else would flow. He knelt, grasping the large wooden handle of the bellows. With a steady, rhythmic push and pull, he began to draw air into the heart of the nascent fire. The bellows sighed, a deep, resonant breath, and the flame responded, growing stronger, hungrier. More coal, a measured amount, was added, carefully placed to encourage the heat. The air, pushed by Jacob's tireless arm, rushed over the coal, turning it from dull black to a vibrant, fiery red. The forge roared to life, a deep, hungry growl that resonated through the shop. Sparks, like tiny incandescent stars, erupted from the heart of the flame, dancing momentarily before winking out. The air around the forge shimmered, heat radiating outwards, pushing back the morning chill. Jacob watched, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. The fire, the very soul of the blacksmith's craft, was awake. It was time to begin the hammer's song. He reached for a length of raw iron, thick and unyielding, and prepared to offer it to the fiery maw. The day and its challenges had truly begun. Fire and iron. The first light barely kissed the eastern horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and pale oranges when Jacob stepped into the forge. The air, still holding the night's chill, offered a stark contrast to the heat he was about to unleash. He moved with an economical grace born of years, his calloused hands already anticipating the heft of tools, the bite of heat. The forge, a squat brick monster in the corner, sat cold and dark, a sleeping beast. Jacob stoked the banked coals, feeding them kindling and then larger pieces of wood, the smell of wood smoke soon joining the lingering scent of iron and oil. He worked the bellows with a steady rhythm, fanning the embers until they glowed, a miniature sunrise within the forge's maw. He selected a rod of raw iron, thick and unyielding, from a rack near the wall. It was cold to the touch, dense with the promise of transformation. He placed it carefully into the heart of the forge, positioning it precisely within the glowing coals. The iron, at first, seemed to resist the heat, its dull grey surface stubbornly unchanged. But Jacob knew the dance. He watched, eyes narrowed, as the surface began to shimmer, then deepen to a cherry red. The edges softened, the metallic sheen giving way to a more liquid appearance. A deeper crimson spread, like blood blooming beneath the skin. Then a brilliant orange. Finally, a dazzling, almost unbearable yellow-white. It was then, when the iron hummed with stored energy, that it was ready. The roar of the fire intensified as he worked the bellows one last time, a guttural breath that filled the forge with a sense of immense power. Sweat already beaded on his brow, despite the crisp morning air outside. The heat radiating from the forge was a palpable presence, a living thing that demanded respect. He reached for the long-handled tongs, their jaws crafted to grip the rod securely. With a practiced motion, he plunged them into the inferno, clamping down on the glowing metal. The air crackled around him as he pulled the rod free, a streak of incandescent light in the dimness. The heat was an immediate assault, a wave that washed over him. He felt it on his skin, through his thick leather apron, even through the soles of his boots. The brilliant light of the iron seared his vision for a moment before his eyes adjusted. He brought the rod over to the anvil, its flat, polished surface a dark counterpoint to the glowing metal. The clang of the iron landing on the steel was a sharp, resonating note that cut through the hiss of the fire. He raised the hammer, a heavy, perfectly balanced tool that felt like an extension of his own arm. It was an old hammer, passed down through generations, its head smooth and worn from countless blows. The first strike was deliberate, powerful, aimed at the very center of the rod. Clang! The sound reverberated through the forge, a primal declaration. Sparks flew, a dazzling shower of tiny stars, as the hammer met the incandescent metal. The iron, still pulsing with heat, surrendered to the force, flattening slightly, elongating. He turned the rod, repositioning it with the tongs, then struck again. Clang! The rhythm began to assert itself, a steady cadence that filled the workshop. His muscles strained, the tendons in his arms standing out like cords. Each blow was precise, calculated. He wasn't just hitting the metal, he was coaxing it, persuading it, bending it to his will. The air grew thick with the smell of hot metal, a sharp metallic tang that mingled with the lingering wood smoke. The iron, though still fiercely bright, began to cool with each hammer blow, its color subtly shifting from blinding white to a more manageable orange. He had to work quickly, efficiently, before it cooled too much and became stubborn again. There was a narrow window, a fleeting moment when the iron was pliable, obedient. This was where skill met speed, where instinct guided the hand. Jacob's face was set in a mask of concentration, his breathing deep and even. The legacy of his family, the weight of generations of knowledge, rode on every swing of that hammer. This wasn't just shaping metal, it was preserving a way of life. The urgency of that task, the quiet desperation to hold on to what was fading, fueled every powerful, rhythmic blow. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that each piece he wrought was a small, defiant act against the tide of time. A master's touch. The clang of hammer on steel was a familiar rhythm in Jacob's shop, a melody composed over decades. Today, it was less a song of creation and more a final, resonant chord of completion. He held a finished horseshoe, its curve flawless, the nail holes punched with precise, even spacing. He ran a gloved thumb along the inner rim, feeling for any burr, any imperfection that might trouble a horse's gait. Satisfied, he set it with its three brethren, ready for collection. Next, a pair of hinges for the new schoolhouse door. These were heavier, designed for durability, their intricate pin mechanisms smooth as glass. Jacob had forged them from raw iron, bending and shaping the stubborn metal into graceful, functional forms. The final step was oiling, a slow, deliberate process where he worked a dark, viscous substance into every joint, every surface, ensuring longevity and silent operation. He watched the light catch the oiled metal, a deep, satisfying luster emerging. Each piece, no matter how small, carried the imprint of his dedication, a silent testament to a skill honed over a lifetime. It wasn't just metalwork. It was a preservation of a way of life, a defiant stand against the encroaching tide of mass production. A small shadow fell across the forge's threshold, followed by the tentative shuffling of feet. Jacob looked up, wiping a smear of soot from his brow with the back of his hand. Young Samuel stood there, eyes wide, a slight tremor in his usually boisterous frame. The boy was a whirlwind of energy most days, but now he was utterly still, captivated by the spectacle of the forge. "Good morning, Samuel," Jacob rumbled, his voice gentler than the hammer blows he usually delivered. Samuel offered a shy nod, his gaze fixed on the cooling steel Jacob had just laid out. The air in the shop was thick with the scent of coal smoke, hot metal, and a faint, sweet tang of oak from the bellows. Above the forge, the light streamed through the dusty window, illuminating motes dancing in the air, a golden haze around Jacob's broad shoulders. "Are those finished?" Samuel finally managed, pointing to the hinges. His voice was a soft whisper against the low hiss of the cooling trough. Jacob picked up one of the hinges, turning it in his hand. "Aye, these are ready. For the schoolhouse door they are." He watched Samuel's eyes follow the hinge, absorbing every detail. The boy's curiosity was palpable, a bright spark in the dimness of the shop. Samuel took a hesitant step closer, then another, until he was just a few feet from Jacob. His small hands were clasped behind his back, a picture of respectful awe. How do you make them so exact? Like the holes for the nails on the horseshoe, they're all the same. And these hinges, they move so smooth." He gestured with a quick, earnest motion towards the oiled metal. "My papa's hinges on the barn door, they creak something fierce." Jacob chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "Well, Samuel, it's a bit of practice, a bit of patience, and knowing the metal. You have to learn its song, you see. When it's hot, it's pliable, like clay. You tell it what to be, and if you listen, it tells you how to get there." He picked up a small, ornate latch he'd been working on, a decorative piece for a hope chest. It was delicate, with tiny spirals and a complex locking mechanism. He held it out for Samuel to see.
Samuel gasped, leaning closer, his eyes tracing the intricate curves.
"How?" he whispered again, a new note of wonder in his voice. "How do you make the iron bend like that? It's so hard." "It is hard, yes," Jacob agreed, his gaze softening as he looked at the boy's eager face. "But heat changes things. Heat and the right touch. It's like teaching a young colt. You don't break it, you guide it. Gently, but firmly." He paused, looking from the small latch to Samuel's earnest face. The boy wasn't just curious. He was genuinely fascinated, a rare thing in an age where machines did the work. Jacob felt a flicker of something long dormant, a desire to share, to impart knowledge that was steadily fading, piece by painstaking piece, with each passing year. The weight of his family's legacy, the generations of Smiths before him, settled on his shoulders. But this time, it felt less like a burden and more like a purpose. Old ways, new worries. The rhythmic clang of Jacob's hammer on scorching steel served as Samuel's daily reveille. Almost every morning, the boy materialized in the smithy entrance, a silent, absorbed observer. The usual village bustle that animated him evaporated here, replaced by a quiet reverence. His wide eyes meticulously followed Jacob's every arc, each explosion of sparks. Jacob, in turn, grew increasingly aware of the young acolyte-in-waiting, often catching Samuel mimicking his motions, a phantom hammer held aloft, a silent, concentrated thwack accompanying the genuine blow. One particular Tuesday, as the morning chill persisted despite the burgeoning sun, Jacob meticulously shaped a delicate latch for the village baker's new bread box. The dull red iron hissed softly as he plunged it into the water trough, a plume of steam briefly shrouding Samuel's face.
When it dissipated,
the boy's expression was one of absolute wonder. "How do you know precisely when to strike it, Jacob?" he murmured, his voice barely audible above the forger's muted roar. Jacob paused, wiping sweat from his brow. He regarded the boy, then the nascent latch, a curious blend of satisfaction and melancholy stirring within him. "It's in the metal's feel, Samuel. The hue, its pliability, and a lifetime of practice." A rare, gentle smile touched his lips. "Some things are simply ingrained." Yet, even as he spoke of instinct and tradition, a gnawing unease began to take root. The cadence of his days had subtly altered. Early mornings, once a vibrant hub of villagers seeking repairs or new commissions, were now subdued. Sarah had already been up, tending hens and brewing coffee, its aroma now mingling with coal smoke and quenching metal. But the steady influx of patrons seemed to have dwindled to a trickle. A week, sometimes more, would pass without a single new order for a plowshare or a wagon wheel repair. He recalled the ceaseless demand from his father's era, the forge glowing almost continuously from dawn till dusk. Farmers depended on their work. Carpenters sought their custom hinges. The smith had been the community's vital pulse, indispensable. Now, the old horse-drawn carts still rumbled by, but fewer and fewer halted at his shop. The younger generation, he noted with a pang, seemed to favor the mass-produced, factory-made implements available from distant English stores. They were cheaper, Jacob conceded, but they lacked the spirit, the resilience, the precision of a hand-forged piece. The silence, once a solace, now felt oppressive. It was a silence that spoke of progress, perhaps, but also of forgetting. Jacob finished the latch, the final rivet affixed with a decisive tap-tap-tap. He held it up, admiring the graceful curve, the robust mechanism. It was faultless,
a testament to his mastery. But who would truly appreciate it in a world increasingly valuing convenience over craftsmanship? He looked at Samuel, still captivated, tracing the imaginary path of the hammer in the air. The boy was an untainted vessel, ready to absorb. Jacob saw in him a spark of hope, a chance to prevent the embers of his family's ancient craft from expiring completely. But the world beyond the smithy's door was shifting, a change Jacob felt in the quiet hum of his forge, in the diminishing pile of new orders. The thought, cold as an iron bar left out overnight, settled in his stomach. What if, despite his utmost efforts, the old ways simply had no place in the new world? What then, for the knowledge in his bones, the skill in his hands, the legacy of generations? The thought was a bitter draught, chilling him to the core. "Samuel," Jacob said, his voice a touch gruffer than usual. "Fetch me that small file from the workbench, will you?" It was a minor instruction, a simple chore. But in that moment, it felt like a genesis, a tentative reach against the encroaching tide of oblivion. The boy sprang into action, eager to be useful. Jacob watched him, a flicker of something akin to urgency sparking in his gaze. He had to instruct him. He had to, before it was too late. Before the last spark of the old ways was extinguished by the cold indifference of the new. He picked up another piece of raw iron, its weight suddenly feeling heavier than before. The first chill of autumn had truly settled, not just a crispness, but a bone-deep cold that bit at the edges of the morning. Jacob had already stoked the forge, the rhythmic hiss of bellows a familiar comfort in the pre-dawn gloom. Sparks danced like fireflies caught in a perpetual twilight as he hammered a new shoe for Bess, old man Hemming's mare. The smell of burning coal and hot metal mingled with the faint, sweet scent of Sarah's brewing coffee drifting in from the house. He worked with a quiet intensity, each strike of the hammer precise, born of decades spent coaxing stubborn iron into elegant form. He was just turning the glowing metal one last time when the crunch of wagon wheels on gravel broke the morning's peace. Farmer Miller's voice, rough with concern, carried through the thin air. "Jacob, you there?" Jacob set the finished shoe aside, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. "Aye, Miller, come on in." Miller's sturdy frame filled the doorway, his breath pluming in the cold air. Behind him, hitched to his wagon, lay a sight that made Jacob's brow furrow. The dark, heavy iron of an antique plough, its share unmistakably fractured. Miller didn't mince words. "It's the old McCormick, Jacob. Snapped clean off on a buried root this morning. The ground's getting hard, and I need to turn that south field before the first real frost sets in." He gestured to the broken implement with a frustrated flick of his wrist. "Tried to find a replacement part in town. Checked the co-op, even called out to that hardware store over in Millersville. They all just shook their heads. Said they haven't seen parts for a plow like this in 50 years. Jacob walked over, his keen eyes already assessing the damage. The plow was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, solid and well-worn, its curves and angles speaking of an era when tools were built to last generations, not just seasons. The break was clean, right through the neck of the share, a jagged wound in the otherwise smooth, dark metal. He ran a thumb over the cold iron, feeling the rough edges. "Aye, I can see why they'd struggle. This isn't cast iron, not exactly. It's a forged steel alloy, much tougher, but also much harder to repair if you don't know how to work it." He nodded slowly, a familiar challenge taking root in his mind. No modern bolt-on parts would even come close to fitting the mountings on this. It's too specific, too bespoke. Miller sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair.
Exactly. They kept trying to sell me some flimsy new share, said I could just adapt it. Adapt it? That old plow has turned more earth than any 3 new ones combined. It's strong, Jacob, or it was, and I need it. The soil in that south field needs that deep cut this plow gives it. Jacob picked up the broken piece, turning it over in his hands. It was heavy, substantial, a testament to the old ways. The difficulty of the task ahead became clear. He couldn't just weld it back together. The stress of plowing would snap a simple weld in no time.
He'd have to forge a new piece, carefully replicating the exact angles and temper, then integrate it seamlessly. It would require precise heat, careful hammering, and an intimate understanding of the metal itself. It was the kind of work that few smiths even understood anymore, let alone possessed the skill to execute. He looked at Miller, seeing the genuine worry in the farmer's eyes. This wasn't just a repair, it was an urgent necessity. The rhythm of the seasons waited for no man, and if that field wasn't turned soon, the next year's harvest would suffer. Jacob felt a flicker of both melancholy and satisfaction. Melancholy for a world that was slowly forgetting the value of such hands-on skill, and satisfaction in knowing that, for now, he still held the key to such problems. "It'll be a good day's work, Miller," Jacob finally said, his voice steady. "Maybe 2, if the metal proves stubborn. I'll need to heat that entire section, work it slowly. But I can fix it. It won't be as good as new, mind you.
It'll be better. Stronger, even." A faint smile touched his lips. "You leave it with me. I'll send Samuel over with a message when it's ready." Miller's shoulders visibly relaxed. "Thank you, Jacob. Truly. I knew you were the only one who could do it." He turned to leave, then paused. "Anything I can do to help?" Jacob shook his head, already planning the sequence of heats and hammers. "Just keep an eye on the weather, Miller, and pray for a few more days without a hard freeze." The plow lay on the ground, a silent challenge waiting to be met. The forge fire, now roaring to life, seemed to pulse with renewed purpose. The sun was a mere suggestion of warmth on the eastern horizon when Jacob first stirred the coals in the forge. He knew this day would be a crucible, both for the metal and for himself. The plough part, a gnarled, broken relic of Farmer Miller's agricultural past, sat on his workbench, its jagged edges a testament to the forces it had once endured. Jacob had studied its contours last night, mapping out the repairs in his mind, envisioning the new piece taking shape under his hammer. He pumped the bellows, a steady rhythm that coaxed the slumbering embers to life. Orange light bloomed in the darkness of the smithy, chasing away the morning chill. The air filled with the familiar, comforting scent of wood smoke and hot metal. He selected a hefty bar of raw iron, its surface rough and unyielding, a stark contrast to the smooth, worn handle of his forging hammer. This wouldn't be a quick repair. This would be a creation, a testament to a craft that few still practiced with such dedication. The first heat was always the slowest, the metal resisting the transformation. Jacob plunged the iron into the heart of the forge, the flames licking greedily at its surface. He waited, patiently, his gaze fixed on the glowing bar, reading the subtle shifts in its color, anticipating the moment it would surrender to his will. When the iron reached a brilliant cherry red, he pulled it out with tongs, the heat radiating off it in visible waves. The clang of hammer on anvil filled the smithy, a resounding note of purpose. Each strike was deliberate, a precise transfer of force, shaping the stubborn material inch by painstaking inch. Sparks flew, incandescent calligraphy against the shadowy walls, marking the passage of each impact. As the morning wore on, the smithy grew hotter, the air thick with the smell of scorched metal and Jacob's own exertion. Sweat beaded on his forehead, trickled down his temples, and stained the collar of his work shirt. He paused only to wipe his brow with the back of a calloused hand, his focus unwavering. The rhythmic bellows, the roar of the fire, and the persistent ring of the hammer became a singular, hypnotic symphony.
He'd learned long ago that forging wasn't just about brute strength. It was about understanding the metal, coaxing it, persuading it to adopt the form he envisioned. He used various hammers, each with a different weight and face, to draw out, upset, and flatten the iron, slowly transforming the raw bar into something resembling the missing piece of the plow. The noonday sun beat down on the roof, turning the smithy into an oven. Jacob's muscles ached, a deep, persistent thrumming in his shoulders and arms, but he pushed through it. The new plow part, still crude, began to take on a recognizable shape. He repeatedly returned it to the forge, reheating it, then back to the anvil, hammering out imperfections, refining its curves and angles. The sound of sizzling as he plunged the hot metal into the quench tank was a momentary reprieve, a hiss of triumph before the next round of intense shaping. Steam rose in a cloud, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of cooling iron. He worked through the afternoon, his movements becoming a practiced dance between fire and steel. The light outside began to fade, casting long shadows that stretched across the workshop floor. Jacob was drenched, his shirt clinging to him like a second skin, but a sense of fierce satisfaction began to bloom within him. The plough part, no longer a mere block of iron, had gained its identity. It had the correct thickness, the right curvature, the proper holes for bolting it to the ploughshare. He held it up, scrutinizing every surface, running a thumb along its freshly forged edges. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was strong, resilient, and true to the original design. With a final, gentle tap of a smaller hammer to smooth a stubborn burr, Jacob let out a long, slow breath. The fire in the forge had dwindled to a soft glow, mirroring the fading light of the day. He wiped his hands on a rag, the grease and soot a badge of a day well spent. The new plough part lay on the anvil, a silent testament to his skill and endurance. It was more than just a repair, it was a continuation, a thread connecting generations of craftsmanship. Farmer Miller's plough would work again, and with it, a piece of the past would be preserved, forged not just from iron, but from a day of fire and sweat. The fix. The last light of day, fractured by the oak canopy, painted the anvil with dancing shadows. Jacob's brow was slick with sweat, a gritty mix of coal dust and iron filings. His muscled arms burned with a deep, familiar ache, a constant companion for hours now. Time had dissolved. The rhythmic clang of hammer on steel was his only chronometer. For what felt like an age, he'd coaxed and beaten, twisted and cooled, sculpting the stubborn metal. The air, thick with the tang of scorched iron and wood smoke, clung heavy around him. Finally, with a grunt that seemed to pull from his very core, Jacob plunged the glowing piece into the water trough. A violent hiss erupted, followed by a curtain of steam that briefly veiled his vision. When it dissipated, the newly forged ploughshare, still radiating a faint heat, rested on the workbench. It was magnificent, formidable, almost impossibly so, its subtle gleam promising resilience against the unyielding earth. The curves were exact, the edges sharp and true, a testament to meticulous hours and unwavering concentration. This wasn't merely a repair, it was a creation, born of fire and brute strength, tempered with an artisan's touch. Just then, Farmer Miller, a man whose face usually bore the deep furrows of the land's worries, appeared in the doorway. His customary stoicism had given way to an almost childlike anticipation. For the past hour, he'd been a silent, hopeful sentinel. Jacob wiped his hands on a grimy rag, gesturing toward the workbench.
It's ready, Levi. Miller approached cautiously, his gaze riveted on the new plow part. He reached out a hesitant hand, tracing the cool, smooth metal. His calloused fingers, seasoned by years of tilling, lingered on a particularly elegant curve. A slow, profound smile transformed his tired features. "Jacob," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. It's flawless. Better than the original, I dare say." He picked it up, hefting its substantial weight, testing its balance. "This will cleave through the spring soil like a hot knife through butter." The sheer relief emanating from Miller was palpable, a wave of calm after days of gnawing anxiety. His entire livelihood hinged on the plow's efficiency. The broken shear had threatened to derail his planting season, jeopardizing his harvest and his family's sustenance. Jacob watched him, a quiet satisfaction blossoming in his own chest. This was his purpose. Not for the coin, though essential, but for the tangible impact of his labor, the immediate aid he could offer his community. "Thank you, Jacob," Miller said again, his eyes glistening faintly. "Truly, thank you. I don't know what I would have done without you. No one else possesses your skill, not anymore." He shook his head, a faint sadness shadowing his face. "They build them differently these days, machines that break beyond repair. But you still mend. You still forge to last." A faint bell tinkled from the house, and the inviting aroma of fresh coffee drifted into the workshop. Sarah, Jacob's wife, was signaling supper. Jacob nodded toward the sound. "Come inside, Levi. Sarah's got coffee brewed. We can discuss how it fits then." Miller's smile widened further. "That sounds mighty fine, Jacob." "Mighty fine indeed." He carefully set the plow part back on the bench as if it were a precious jewel and followed Jacob out of the workshop, the last sliver of daylight painting the world in hues of orange and purple. The knowledge of a job well done, of a community member helped, settled over Jacob like a warm blanket. He walked toward the house, the ache in his muscles now a satisfying thrum, the scent of coffee and wood smoke mingling with the lingering scent of iron, the scent of his calling, the scent of a skill that, though fading in the wider world, remained vibrant and vital here, in the heart of their quiet community. Miller's relief, he knew, would spread like wildfire through the small settlement. News of a successful repair, especially one so crucial, always did. It was a testament not just to Jacob's hands, but to the enduring strength of their way of life. Whispers of worth. The scent of roasted corn and simmering beans drifted from the kitchen, a welcome counterpoint to the lingering metallic tang of the forge. Jacob dipped his calloused hands into the bucket of cool well water beside the anvil, the shock a familiar balm to weary muscles. He watched the last tendrils of smoke curl from the iron before it cooled, reflecting the faint amber glow of the setting sun. The plowshare, newly forged and fitted, lay gleaming on a workbench, its edge honed to a razor sharpness. It was a good day's work, a satisfying end to the long hours of hammering and shaping. He heard the creak of the front gate and looked up to see Farmer Miller, his usually furrowed brow now smooth, a wide smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Jacob, that plowshare, it's a marvel." Miller's voice, usually quiet and reserved, boomed with genuine enthusiasm. "My boys hitched it up this afternoon, and it cut through that stubborn clay like butter."
"Better than new, I tell you." He clapped Jacob on the shoulder, a hearty thud that echoed the blacksmith's own quiet pride. "I told everyone at the market this morning. They couldn't believe it. Said no one could fix it. Not properly anyway. But you brought it back to life." Later, as Sarah served supper, the clatter of cutlery punctuated by the gentle rhythm of the rocking chair, Jacob recounted Miller's praise. Sarah smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "I told you, your hands have a way with iron, a way that speaks to its very heart."
She poured him a mug of steaming coffee, its rich aroma filling the kitchen. The warmth spread through him, a comforting counterpoint to the day's exertion. The following morning, the usual quiet of the lane was broken by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A wagon, laden with a peculiar assortment of broken implements, pulled up to the smithy.
Elias, the cooper, clambered down, his face etched with a mixture of hope and skepticism.
"Jacob, they say you worked wonders on Miller's plow. I've got this old saw blade, belonged to my grandfather, cracked right down the middle. Most folks would say it's for scrap, but, well, I heard you might see something different." He gestured to a long, hand-forged saw, its teeth worn smooth in places, but clearly a tool of significant sentimental value. Before Jacob could properly assess it, another buggy arrived. This time, it was Martha Weaver, her arms cradling a broken iron gate hinge, intricately scrolled and clearly part of a much larger, ornate piece. "My great-grandmother's gate," she explained, her voice tinged with sadness. "It snapped in the storm. The new ones, they just don't have the same character, you know? They look soulless."
But Miller swore you could mend anything that still had a spark of life in it.
The days that followed blurred into a continuous stream of challenging repairs. A broken bell from the meeting house, its bronze tongue silenced. A rusted ancient spinning wheel pedal. The delicate latch on a family Bible box. Each item carried not just a physical defect, but a weight of history. A story waiting to be heard and preserved. Jacob found himself not just hammering and shaping, but listening, delving into the nuances of each piece, understanding its purpose and its sentimental worth. He wasn't just a blacksmith, he was a restorer of memories, a keeper of the past. The work was demanding, requiring a different kind of focus than forging new tools. It demanded patience, a keen eye for subtle imperfections, and an intuitive understanding of how the old masters had worked their metal.
He often found himself studying the original welds,
Tracing the grain of the worn iron, trying to decipher the intent of the hand that had first crafted it. It was a silent dialogue across generations, a connection to a craftsmanship that had slowly faded from common practice. The word spread beyond the immediate community. Farmers from neighboring settlements, hearing tales of the miracle blacksmith, started making the journey, their wagons laden with objects deemed irreparable elsewhere. They brought stories of newfangled machines that failed and mass-produced tools that lacked durability. They spoke of a growing weariness with planned obsolescence, a longing for things that were made to last, to be repaired, to be passed down.
One afternoon, a young man, barely out of his apprenticeship as a carpenter, stood awkwardly by the forge, watching Jacob meticulously repair a broken wagon wheel spoke.
"My master says, he says your work is like seeing into the soul of the material," he offered, his voice hushed with reverence. "He says the old ways, they had something we've forgotten." Jacob looked up, a faint smudge of soot on his cheek, his eyes bright in the dim light of the smithy. "The old ways," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They ask for patience. They ask for respect. And they ask you to listen to the whisper of the iron." He tapped the newly mended spoke, the sound a clear, resonant note. The young man nodded slowly, a newfound understanding dawning in his eyes. The whispers of worth were growing louder, carrying on the wind, reminding them all of what truly mattered.
A new spark.
The rhythmic clink-clank of Jacob's hammer against the anvil was a familiar soundtrack to Samuel's days. But lately, a different kind of music seemed to emerge from the forge. It wasn't the blunt percussion of a new tool being shaped, but the careful, almost surgical taps that accompanied the restoration of old, cherished items. Today, it was the miller's broken plowshare, a piece of rusted iron that looked more like a relic than a functional implement. Samuel had been sent to the smithy with a message from his father, inquiring about a delivery of freshly milled grain. He delivered the news, but found himself lingering, drawn by the mesmerizing dance of light and shadow in the workshop. Jacob, sweat slicking his brow, moved with a grace that belied the arduous nature of his work. His hands, calloused and strong, held the ancient plowshare with a reverence Samuel hadn't noticed before.
The blacksmith heated a small section in the coals, the iron glowing cherry red, then, with specialized tongs, brought it to the anvil. Instead of powerful blows, Jacob used a series of precise, delicate strikes, shaping the metal as if coaxing it back to its original form. Samuel watched, transfixed. He'd always seen the blacksmith as a creator of new things, horseshoes, hinges, tools for the farm. But watching Jacob restore the plowshare, breathing life back into something old and discarded, was different. It wasn't just about making something new, it was about honoring the past, about preserving stories etched in metal. The air hummed with the energy of creation, a primal force that resonated deep within Samuel. A strange, unfamiliar spark ignited in his own mind, a feeling both exhilarating and daunting. He thought of his own hands, capable enough with a plow handle or a milking pail, but utterly clumsy next to Jacob's practiced movements. Yet the desire to understand, to replicate that meticulous craft, surged through him with unexpected intensity.
He observed Jacob for what felt like an eternity, the smith oblivious to his presence, lost in the intricate details of his work. The old plowshare, once a mangled mess, was slowly regaining its sharp edge, its smooth curve. Jacob wiped his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a smudge of soot, then stepped back, critically examining his progress. A small, satisfied nod confirmed his approval. Taking a deep breath, Samuel finally stepped forward, his voice a little hoarse. "Jacob?" The blacksmith turned, his eyes, usually intense and focused, softening as he recognized Samuel. "Samuel, is there something else your father needs?" Samuel shook his head, his gaze flickering from Jacob's strong hands to the mended plowshare. "No, sir, not from my father." He paused, searching for the right words, the spark within him now a burning ember. I was watching you." Jacob raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing on his lips. "And what did you see?" "I saw magic," Samuel admitted, feeling a blush creep up his neck. "The way you fix things, not just make new ones, but bring old ones back to life. Like the miller's plow, it looked beyond repair." Jacob chuckled softly. "No, Samuel, not magic. Just patience. And knowing the metal. Knowing its history and what it still has left to give." He gestured to a rack of well-worn tools hanging on the wall. "Each one has a story, and sometimes a new chapter needs to be written." Samuel took another breath, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess himself. "Jacob, I want to learn. I want to learn this craft. Will you teach me? Will you take me as your apprentice?" The question hung in the air, punctuated only by the distant caw of a crow. Jacob's face, etched with the lines of his trade, slowly softened into a warm, genuine smile. His eyes, usually discerning and analytical, now twinkled with an emotion Samuel couldn't quite decipher, but which felt like a sunrise after a long night. He saw a flicker of relief, an unburdening that settled over the blacksmith's shoulders. "Samuel," Jacob said, his voice deeper, richer than usual. He reached out and placed a large, reassuring hand on Samuel's shoulder. "I would be honored, truly. For a long time, I have worried about who would carry on this work, who would understand the language of the forge." He squeezed Samuel's shoulder gently. "The fire burns brighter when there are two to tend it. We will start tomorrow. There is much to learn, and much to unlearn too." A wave of exhilaration washed over Samuel, chasing away his apprehension. The rhythmic clink-clank of the hammer, once just a sound, now echoed with the promise of a future. The spark had ignited, and he was ready to fan the flames.